You ever wonder if the very things that kick-started a revolution could, I don't know, just reappear centuries later in a new disguise? Well, today we're going to take a hard look at the founding principles of America and hold them up like a mirror to our world right now. Okay, let's get into it. This right here, this single idea from thinkers like John Locke, was basically philosophical dynamite back in the day. It completely flipped the script. The idea that governments weren't these divine rulers, but were actually creations of the people, for the people, that was a game changer. So Locke called this the social contract. And the deal was pretty simple, really. People agree to hand over just a little bit of their total freedom to a government. And in return, that government has one job, and one job only: protect everyone's natural rights, your life, your liberty, and your property. And here's the kicker: it's a totally conditional agreement. And that brings us right to the heart of what we're talking about today. When you look at all the complexities, the rules, the burdens of modern life, do you ever start to see echoes of that powerful, overbearing government the founders decided to leave behind? To really answer that, we've got to rewind. Let's go back to the very beginning and look at the philosophical blueprint for the entire American experiment. For Locke and the founders, this was everything. These rights, they weren't gifts from a king or a parliament. The belief was that you were born with them. They're just part of being human. And the government's job isn't to grant them, it's just to secure them. So you could think of these as the basic terms and conditions of that contract. It's all built on this idea that power flows from the bottom up, not the top down. And most radical of all, it came with a cancellation clause. If the government breaks the contract and becomes a tyrant, the people have the right to change it or get rid of it altogether. So that idea of consent was absolutely crucial. And one of the biggest flashpoints, one of the biggest grievances for the colonists was, you guessed it, taxation without their consent. Let's see how that compares to today. The famous cry, no taxation without representation. It was never just about the money. It was about the principle of the thing. It was a complete rejection of a system that they felt was totally arbitrary and controlling, making up complex rules and taxes from an ocean away without any of their say-so. Okay, now, fast forward to today. What's really fascinating here is just the sheer scale of the change. The original income tax code back in 1913, it was just 27 pages long. Today, well, there's some debate on the exact number, but most estimates put the U.S. federal tax code and all its regulations at around 10,000 pages. And what does all that complexity cost us? Well, for starters, it costs us our time. A truly staggering 6.5 billion hours every single year. That's time that's not being spent building a business or creating something new or just being with your family. It's spent trying to comply with this massive system. Now you add up that time, plus what we all spend on tax software and professionals, and it adds up to an economic burden of $414 billion a year. To put that into perspective, that is more than the annual revenue of almost every single company in America. It's huge. And this just brilliantly illustrates how deep the complexity really goes. This is Form 1099-B for reporting gains from stocks. It takes up 674 million hours of our time. It's one of the most time-consuming forms out there. And yet the IRS itself hasn't even calculated the out-of-pocket cost. Officially, on their books, it's listed as zero. But the burden isn't just financial. It actually extends to something even more fundamental: our personal liberty and the justice system. See, the founders weren't just worried about their wallets. They were really worried about the unchecked power of the state. So to stop the state from becoming too powerful, they built in protections like the Fourth Amendment. It was meant to be a shield, something to protect citizens from the government just randomly intruding into their lives and taking their property. And listen, the Supreme Court itself has backed this up. The entire point of this amendment was to make it hard for the government to interfere in your life. The default setting was supposed to be freedom, not constant government oversight. In holding all of this up is maybe the most famous principle of American justice. The state has to do all the work. It carries the entire burden of proof. It has to prove you're guilty. You don't have to prove you're innocent. So let's hold that ideal up to the light. How does it look when we compare it to some of the realities of our legal system today? What happens when the people in charge of enforcing the law get protections that the rest of us just don't? Just let that sink in for a second. This is a quote from a real case where police officers were accused of stealing over $225,000 during a search. A federal court gave them immunity, saying that while it might be morally wrong, there wasn't a previous court case with almost the exact same facts to have clearly established that stealing stuff during a search was unconstitutional. And this just highlights a really stark contrast. For you and me, the rule is ignorance of the law is no excuse. We're expected to navigate all 10,000 pages of that tax code. But for many government officials, there's this legal shield called qualified immunity, and it creates a totally different standard. They're often protected unless their exact action was already ruled illegal in a nearly identical case from the past. Here's a real-world example of how that plays out. Police were called for what the woman involved, Melanie Kelsey, said was just some horseplay. After things had calmed down, she went to walk over to her daughter. An officer, with no warning, ran up and slammed her to the ground, breaking her collarbone. The court gave the officer immunity. Why? Because no prior case had established that a blind body slam in those exact circumstances was an unconstitutional use of force. So when you see a 10,000-page tax code, a $414 billion compliance burden, and a justice system that seems to have two different sets of rules, it raises a really fundamental question. What happens when the people feel like the social contract just isn't being held up? The founders actually had an answer for this, and it came straight from John Locke. This phrase, an appeal to heaven, was their philosophical last resort, and it wasn't necessarily a call for literal divine intervention. No, what it really meant was something profound about who's ultimately in charge. It means that when the government and the people are at a total impasse, when the government says its actions are fine and the people say they're tyrannical, there's no higher earthly authority to go to. In other words, the final court of appeal is the people themselves. And that leaves us with this one final, really critical question. The founders believed the ultimate check on power wasn't a court or a Congress, but the people. So when the ideals of a nation and its day-to-day realities seem to be in conflict, who gets the final say? Well, according to the philosophy that founded America, the answer is you.